Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and Media Vision. Tonight, I'm pleased to present Origins Fellow Christopher Cullis, who is the Francis Hobart Herrick Professor of Biology and former Dean at Case Western Reserve University and Program Director of the Plant Genome Research Program of the National Science Foundation. Raised in Rhodesia, he's currently in the process of domesticating an African desert plant with nutritional properties superior to soybeans. And tonight, he's the first speaker in our 3-week series on food, speaking about a multitude of food, the origin of food crops. Dr. Cullis.
Today I really wanted to start off by talking about the food crops we use, the food crops we don't use, how they evolved, the kinds of changes that were necessary in order to get to where we are. And then next week we're going to talk a little bit more about how we're going ahead with trying to improve that in some form or another. So where does the world's food come from? Different foodstuffs in different parts of the world. You've got some food deserts in North Africa where there's deserts. There's some deserts down here, and we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. But we have different crops, and I'm going to look at what crops people use and where they come from as we move through this. So everybody grows food, so there's local food and there's international food. And to start with today, I'm going to talk much more about that international food process. So this sort of surprises a lot of people. How many food crops do we have? So if you ask about everything that we use, there's about 7,000 different species that we eat, that we know are safe to eat in one form or another, or at least there are safe versions of it. And that's something that we always have to worry about, that, you say, you can have a tomato, and the ones you know are really good to eat. You go and get a wild one, and it's full of alkaloids, and you have one bite, and you drop dead. So you have to be really careful about knowing what you eat. So the same way that I will never eat a mushroom that I pick because I don't know anything about it. But I know mycologists who really know which mushrooms are safe and which ones aren't. And they say, here, these are going to be really tasty. And I'm more than happy to cook them and eat them. But we have a lot of history of foods that have been eaten in lots of parts of the world, most of which we don't use to any significant extent at this point. We just use a smaller set of those. So there's about 7,000 different species we could work with, and that's part of what we have to look forward to in the future. There's about 120 of them that are used in particular countries in one form or another. Okay? Lots of them are very minor crops because they're used by a very small group of people in a particular region, but they're important for food security for that region. And so there's a whole series of those, and those ones, a lot of those ones are called orphan crops. And the reason that they're called orphan crops is that there's been no investment into them because they're not a big market. Then a company's not going to want to spend millions or billions of dollars in improving it if the market's only going to be for 10,000 people, all right? They're never going to be able to recoup that. And so these orphan crops are out there. A lot of them have really good properties, but they don't have a big enough population that wants to use them to make it worthwhile doing anything with, all right? And then in the center of that string, there's a group of about 30 plant species which make up pretty well all of the food that we eat. All right? So for most people, there's that subset, and that makes up for their calorie intake pretty well everything. So this is where we are at the moment, and I'm going to make some caveats. So here are the set of most important food energy supply of the crops we use. And there's a caveat that I have to say, because here, where are we? Here's maize, all right, 7%. That's because that's the portion of the maize that's grown, or the energy that's from it, that comes directly from eating the plant, all right? So maize actually makes up a vast amount more of our energy supply because most of it that is produced is fed to animals. And then we eat the meat. That's not on the slide. This is what we eat that directly comes from the plant material itself, not processed through some other organism that we're now eating. All right? And so for ones that we eat, rice is the largest, wheat is next, then there's soybean, and again, soybean is an oil here, but we actually grow a huge amount of soybeans, and again, that's used for animal feed. It's not used for human consumption on the whole. And corn as well, or maize, is here. So you have all of these other ones that are around here. One of the big ones in others that I always like to point out, since I have worked on it, is banana, which is in fact a really major crop for certain parts of the world. So if you take bananas and plantains, they provide a protein and starch and an energy source for lots of Southeast Asia and Central Africa. And so it's an important crop, but again, it's one that's an orphan crop in many ways because it's only worked on by international institutes that get money because they're supporting those regions of the world. So the big four crops are wheat, rice, corn, and soy, all right? In terms of the acreage that is grown, 75% of the world's total area is planted to these four crops, all right? All the rest of them, of that 7,000, make up 25% of the arable area. So these are really important. And this is what you sort of know about and see for these crops. So here's wheat, all right? This is not a grassland. This is the Canadian prairies. This is a wheat field, if you like. This is solid wheat grown, all right? It's amazing the sort of acreages that we use. Again, here's rice. As far as the eye can see, there's a single crop being grown some way. Here's corn, and again, flying over the Midwest in the middle of summer, if you look out of the plane, what you see is circles of corn growing that's irrigated. And what I'd like to point out, because I'm going to come back to, is this is like a lawn, but it's a lawn that's 7 feet high. Right? So if you look at that lot, these corn plants are all virtually identical. This is something that we've wound up doing, which is to enable us to get a uniform crop that's high yielding, that we can get lots from, and so we then plant it out over enormous areas of the world and harvest it and use it. And there's lots of question marks that people have about, well, why do we have this sort of monoculture? And I'll come back to that. It's because we can get lots and lots and lots of yield from these particular plants, or they're the ones that we need for what we're doing in terms of food processing. And the last one is soybeans. And again, you see this whole swath of area that is a single crop that's planted, that's uniform, but it's not. The soybean you see here, 50 miles down the road, may not be a good soybean to grow there. Soybeans in particular, because I'm going to come back to this a bit later, is a crop that is incredibly sensitive to temperature and light. And so for a soybean, when the breeders work with it, they have, so we say this one here matures in a certain number of days. And so it's got to mature, flower, set the seeds, have the seeds ripen before you get the first frost. All right? So if you're growing this in Canada, you've got maybe 4 or 5 weeks less because you can't plant it as early and you have to harvest it earlier than you do if you're planting it somewhere in southern Iowa. And soybean has a range where they're looking at the particular variety they grow that changes by their maturity by half a day. So they have it over a 20 to 25 day period, and they have maturity groups that are in half-day increments, and they're actually breeding this, and when they go through the testing, say, how far does it go? Because if I don't get it to flower now and set seed and have that seed mature, we're not going to manage to harvest a decent harvest from this. And the farmer's not going to buy my seed next year because he's going to say, look, this is rubbish. It did not produce a decent yield. So all of these ones, wherever we look, whether it's corn, you can see they're all have tassels, they're all flowering at the same time, so you can have them flower, produce pollen, produce cobs, and be able to harvest them simultaneously. Again, if you come back to rice, you look at this, the field is all uniform. The wheat is harder to see, but it's obviously there's not places where it's much taller or much shorter. Everything is uniform. And so that's one of the challenges that's out there for all of these crops is how do we generate an improvement that's also uniform across everywhere where we want to grow it in order for the farmers to have enough yield to grow to buy that seed. How do we produce the seed? How much seed do you need if you're going to plant millions of acres of corn? It's not, you can get a bag of seed. Well, it's not a bag of seed. It is railroad trucks loads of seed in order to put it in. So that's where we are at the moment. So we have these 4 particular plant species that provide this enormous amount of our foodstuffs, either for direct consumption or for feeding to animals. And I'm going to go to this next slide because I'm going to talk about it for a moment before we get to questions. This is wheat. And one of the issues that's out there now is that for much the developing world, wheat is a symbol of prosperity. So where many parts of the world ate corn, now they want to eat bread because that's what the Western diet has, that's what developed countries use, and so there's a change, and they're trying to, so if you want to try and grow wheat in the tropics, it's really hard because wheat does not grow well in hot climates. And so what people are trying to do is to grow things that are not necessarily appropriate because that's the food stuff that people want. And so at this point, I'll take questions.
Could you give us some examples of the national foods that you mentioned in that circle of 120?
So bananas are one, cassava is another one, quinoa is another one, which is coming in. So there's a whole range of ones that, and many of these are now being used. So the problem is quinoa was a food in South America. The indigenous population now find it hard to get because it's now a fad food in the West, and you can get much more by exporting it than selling it in the local market. And so you suddenly get these huge distortions of what people can eat and what people can buy.
I've been doing daily emails with 2 of my friends who live on 2 islands, England and Japan, and they don't have a lot of land there for growing wheat or this kind of thing. And I just learned yesterday that there's something, the buzz name is vertical farming, but basically what they're doing is piping nutrients in a colloidal fluid to the crops, and then they're using these new LED lights to supply the light to grow the plants for photosynthesis. And in talking about this and being a case with this magnificent windmill on the property, the beautiful thing about vegetation is that the crops can be developed that are not sensitive at all to sudden, unpredictable variations in energy input, like you're going to get from wind power. So this is a viable opportunity for growing plants in places like Japan, especially with the high population density, but very little land, and getting a little sick of fish. What else can they eat? But that's something to be considering, that a good source for solar power, energy, wind power, and supplemental a little bit of energy. But I'd like some comment on that.
It's a really difficult question to answer because the energy balance for a crop is incredibly sensitive to inputs. So most plants require a huge amount of nutrients. So what I've been showing you in these huge fields, those fields are not growing, except for possibly soybean, which is using nodules to fix nitrogen. They are getting an enormous amount of fertilizer, all right? And the trouble is, if you look at the energy balance for corn in particular, over the last 60 years, we're actually getting less energy at the end of a corn harvest, even though we're getting much more yield because of the inputs all the way through the process. And so it's an issue that's always there. So if you're going to do vertical farming, right, if you can use natural sunlight, that's the top level. If you've got to put LED lights in, you've got an energy requirement there. If you're going to grow them to something where you're going to get a yield, you've got to give them all the nutrients. all right? You've got to make those. So one of those nutrients is nitrogen. Plants require an enormous amount of nitrogen, which is one of the most expensive fertilizers, and potassium, all right? And so now you've got to have a system. You also, which I haven't mentioned at this point, which is probably going to be the most important constraint, which is water. That's the thing we're going to run out of before anything else.
40 years ago, the Scientific American ran an article about duckweed. And duckweed grows in water, and it has little roots that extend down into the water. It has leaves, and it's a flowering plant. And they claimed that the yield was like 7-fold higher than anything you could get growing in soil. Since it grows in the water, has any work been done on trying to adapt duckweed and similar things to brackish water, where we can use tidal marshes and things like that for?
So the issue really is how well can plants adapt to stresses that they're not used to, all right? And for saline conditions, it's really been very difficult. And so that's one of the issues for many of the areas of the world, which is where they have been irrigating, all right? Irrigation is not the same as rainfall, all right? Rainfall is distilled water, pretty much. Irrigation is groundwater all full of salts, all right? So when you irrigate something, you put it on, the plant will take up the water. It's not going to take up all the minerals that are there. A lot of that water is going to evaporate, and so you're going to salinize your soils, all right? So, and we're trying to find we've been spending a lot of time trying to improve the ability of plants to grow in soils that have more salt. For duckweed, it's trying to find something that you can grow in that area. The other problem is there are ways of generating protein, all right? And duckweed may be one of those that's in the future. Changing the habits of what people eat is really, really difficult. And there's the whole psychology of that, as I say, this whole move away from other staples to wheat is a real problem, because lots of countries that have food insecurity, part of that insecurity is because they're having to import lots and lots of wheat, whereas if they were using local species, they could actually have a much higher level of food security.
Is there a problem with consistency, for instance, that land masses in Canada, I think you said, as far as irrigation, the lower areas, and wind in the upper areas, and even with aerial fertilization or things like that?
So most of the plants we have been bred to have a reasonable level of yield consistency across somewhat different environmental conditions. So that's one of the aspects that you look at when you're developing a new variety. How well does it work here, 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 and here? If it works really well here but really badly here, you're probably not going to use it, because if there's a bad year, if there's less rainfall, if there's a bit of a drought, if there's something else, or a particular hot year, then you're going to get very much less yield. So you're looking for something that may not be the very best, but it's consistent over a whole range of areas. So what I was saying was soybean, wheat, and corn, the variety you grow depends on where you are. For soybean, it's even more specific that in fact they're divided into much smaller niches, all right? Wheat and corn are much bigger niches where they grow well over a range of environments. But yes, there is some of that, but when we have a drought, everything suffers. We don't have really good drought-tolerant plants.
Thank you for joining us. You have been watching Dr. Chris Cullis telling us about the principal food crops that feed the world's human population. For more information on the Origins Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Dr. Cullis will tell us about the domestication of plants for human consumption. Now, back to the talk.
How did we get to where we are now? Sort of the domestication of plants for agriculture is one that's important. So domestication is defined as the human creation of a new form of plant or animal that is definitely different from its wild ancestors and extant wild relatives. That is, things that are out there. So you've specifically found something, you've selected for some set of characteristics and then built those into this, so now it doesn't look like anything that actually existed before. Right? So all of those plants I showed you, you couldn't have found those in the wild. Right? And if they escape from the field, they don't do very well because you really nurture them and tend to them. Agriculture developed about 10,000 years ago in a couple of different places. So one of the origins is certainly the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, where a whole load of different species, and it depends on who you look at, is 8 to 17 or thereabouts. They include wheat and different types of wheat, pea, lentil, and my personal favorite, flax, which is one that I happen to work on. And flax is still a really interesting one because it actually has two products. So most of these other ones are a food crop in some form, or unless you grow cotton, it's a fiber crop. Flax is a bifunctional crop. It's actually, you use the seed, you can use it as an oil crop, as a seed crop, and you can use the stem as a fiber crop for linen and things like that. So it's one of those. So that's one set were developed there. At about the same time, rice was domesticated in China. All right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. And then a bit later, corn was domesticated in and around present-day Mexico about 4,000 years later than that. So I'm going to start with this last example because it's a nice one where we know really well the kinds of events that took place in order to get us to where we are. So here are the starting point and the present-day corn. So on the left, as you look at it, is teosinte, which is the wild progenitor of corn. And in the silver up there is a quarter, all right? So what you're seeing in the red circle is, in fact, the seed pod, if you like, of teosinte up in this corner up here. And that's, as you can see, next to the modern-day corn cob, that's the difference that's happened, all right? So we've taken something that was a nice sort of grass, because that's what teosinte is, and corn is also a grass, and found ways to change it completely from what its natural form was to something that we can now use and use effectively to provide food. So here are some of the changes that have occurred. So we've gone from on the left-hand side, teosinte, which has lots of tillers and sprouts, and we've changed this to have a single main stem, all right? For rice, we haven't done that. So rice is also a grass, but we have rice still tillers, and we get seeds from lots of different stems. So there's been a different emphasis on what we wanted to do as we've selected for particular forms, right? You'll see that on the left-hand side here, there are lots of little cobs on here, all right? So it produces lots of cobs, but each one of those is the single row of seeds, all right? And not very many of them. And so what they wound up doing was, in fact, looking for an unbranched plant, which produced many fewer cobs, but ones of very vastly improved size, all right? And so the size has changed dramatically. So as people found them, they found one that had a bigger cob on it, right? Hey, I got more seeds, all right? I'm going to take the seeds from here and plant that and select and try and pick out something else. So plant breeding in those days was not a deliberate mixture of different types. It was finding something that looked like it might be better and then planting that seed and hoping that, in fact, you got something that was better. Right? And over the years, they then produced a cob that got bigger, had more rows of seed, fewer cobs on the plant, but in the end, more seeds per plant. And so that was the process by which you selected out something that was now going to be much more useful in terms of agriculture and give you more food. So why wouldn't you use it? The other part is to actually change the way the seeds are. So there's a couple of important things. So the original teosinte seeds are covered in this hard gloom, all right? makes it, you've got to break the seed open to get at the piece that you want, which is the kernel that we eat, all right? You don't eat this gloom. It's a hard sort of keratin type of structure, all right? And so you wanted to get rid of that, all right? In getting rid of that, you also have to make sure that the seeds still stay on the cob, all right? So there's also something called shattering, where if you go out in the garden and look at the trees, often what you see is a seed pod, and it's twisted, all right? And it's open. And that's because that particular plant wants to spread its seed, so it twists that and throws its seed out. Well, if you're growing your plant for your food that you want to collect it, you don't want to have to go around scrubbing around the soil trying to find where all the seeds have fallen. You want it to be stuck on the cob so that you can pick up one cob and now you've got everything there. You don't want to have it a hard shell around it, so you've got to get that off before you can eat it. So you select for something like that. And wheat was the same thing. There was a hard gloom on the outside, and selecting for the loss of that, which is in fact a single gene that's been changed, you now have something that's much easier to harvest, much easier to work with, so you select that one and now you grow that one instead. And so you wind up changing the characteristics of your plant so that it makes it easier for you to grow it, to get more of it, and to be able to harvest it more easily. Corn is the poster child, all right? Because corn we've been able to harvest the effect of what's called hybrid vigor, all right? So on here, you see 3 corn plants, all right? The 2 on the outside are what are known as inbreds. They've been plants that have been self-pollinated, so they've been inbred for a large number of generations. You can grow thousands of them, and they look all exactly the same, and they're all like this, all right? The one in the middle is a seed that's been grown from pollen from one of these into the anther of the other one. So it's a combination of these 2 plants on the outside. It's an F1 hybrid. It produces a much bigger plant. It produces more seed, and we're going to talk a bit more about it. And this is called hybrid vigor, all right? And so corn's hybrid vigor is one of the reasons why corn is such an enormous part of the agricultural industry. It's not just the plant that's better. So here are the cobs. The 2 on the outside are from the 2 parents I just showed you. The one on the middle is from a hybrid, all right? So you have this huge advantage of making a hybrid, all right? So why don't all our crops hybrids? Because in most cases, it's really hard to make enough seed, all right? For corn, I'll show you why it's really easy. And so corn has dominated because of that. So to produce hybrid seeds, what you need to do is get the pollen from one plant and fertilize the silks of the other. And you can do it in either direction. All right? Doesn't matter which one you use, you get a hybrid corn plant. All right? And so the important thing is, look at these corn plants. Where's the pollen made? The top. Where's the cob and the seed made? Halfway down. Are they in the same place? No. So now you can actually separate out those 2 parts, all right? So to make a hybrid seed, what you want to do is to have this pollen here not to land on this ear here, but to land over here, and or vice versa, all right? And so the people who make the most money in corn agriculture are not the people who grow corn for the crop. They're the people who grow seed corn, because that has the premium. I grew up, as I said, in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. I had an uncle who was a farmer. He grew corn as a crop. Yeah, he got a reasonable amount for it. But the farm 30 miles down the road were the Browns, who actually grew the seed corn. So my uncle grew 150 acres of corn and made a few $1,000s. The Browns grew 40 acres of seed corn and made a few $100,000. All right? It's a completely different thing. So how does it work? So this is part of what's going on. So here you see the F stands for female, the M stands for male. So for all of the plants that are going to produce an ear that you're going to pollinate, you go through and this machine chops the top off. No tassel. The ones that you want to be male have an empty row, and so they grow up and produce lots of pollen. A single corn plant produces enough pollen to pollinate lots of other corn plants, so you have here 5 or 6 rows of females and 1 row of males, and so all of those then, all the pollen comes through, and when you come to collect your seed corn, you just collect from the F rows and you throw the M rows away. You don't want those ones. Those are selfed. They're useless. Males aren't useless, but we'll go into that a different time. So this is a machine. So for many years, in the Midwest, my understanding is that students would spend their summers walking through cornfields, breaking off the tops of corn plants before they flowered, all right, for all of the rows that were going to be producing hybrid seed. There is a gene that's called male sterility that was used, but then that also made the new plants susceptible to southern leaf corn blight, and so that was kind of in the 1970s that went out of fashion because you got large losses in damp summers, and there's still lots of things we're trying to do, and I'm going to come back to that next week again, a little bit about how we get to there. So that's how we make F2s, and of course, one of the issues that's always out there is farmers being able to save their seed. Well, if you grow an F1, you can save your seed, but you don't want to grow it the next year because it's going to be segregating because it's been pollinated by everything, so it's a mixture of F1s, parents, mixtures of those, and in fact, essentially, you don't get a decent plant. So if that's why F1 seed producers make all that money, because the farmers have to buy new seed every year in order to get a decent crop. You can't keep your own seed no matter how hard you try. So this gives you an idea of what's happened over the last sort of 150 years or so. So for a long time, to about the 1920s, the yields were about the same. So we got more food just by planting more fields, all right? Then genetics really kicked in, and we started to do real plant breeding, and we started to get an improvement in the yield, all right? And then we started to look at F1 hybrids, and corn started to keep going and going and going. And at this, well, actually at about here, we started to put a nitrogen fertilizer on and select for those corn hybrids that could utilize more fertilizer. And, you can see it a little bit better. And this is actually GMOs and biotech, and we'll come back to that later. But you can see the change in corn productivity. So again, come back to the question, why don't we make hybrids of everything? So here's some wheat, all right? Every one of those little seeds, all right, is the equivalent to a corn cob. And every one of those little seeds has its own ovary and its own anthers. And so if you want to make a hybrid wheat crop, you've got to go through and you've got to pull the anthers off every one of those seeds to get one more seed back, all right? And you can try it. You need a microscope, you need a magnifying glass and a pair of tweezers. So that's the reason why we can't make hybrids from everything. And why corn has done so well, because it is so good at being able to, lending itself to this whole agricultural production. Questions?
If you're growing the same crops all the time, how do you keep, I know you use the fertilizer, but doesn't the cost, after a while, doesn't the cost make the production of the product expensive?
So even if you're growing these crops, you do some form of crop rotation. You can't just keep growing the same thing, because it's not just the major nutrients that get taken out. Each plant takes up and requires a different level of what known as micronutrients. And if you keep growing the same thing all the time, you deplete it of those, and it doesn't matter how much fertilizer you give it, it still doesn't grow well. So you rotate it, and there's, so you'll grow corn for 2 years, then soybean for 1 year or 2 years, then corn again. Soybean puts some nitrogen back. It utilizes a different set of micronutrients. You plow in the residue as far as possible, so you replenish some of those. So you do, even in the really large areas, you have to practice some form of crop rotation. You can't just keep growing year after year after year. And that's what the early farmers did. They simply grew the same crop, and when the soil was exhausted, they went somewhere else. We don't have that luxury anymore.
What if you could say a few words about buckwheat It's not an important crop here, but in countries as different as Ukraine and Nepal, it's a major food source. And I think I've read that it's more of a complete protein than, say, wheat or in some other, or it's not a grain, as of course, but.
No, it's one of those plants that is available, but again, does not have the commercial potential or recognized commercial potential for a big enough area to be grown for somebody to go and say, okay, what we really need to do is bring the yields up to what they are for our current wheats. It's not that we can't do it. It's just that it's a cost in time and money and expertise. So one of the things we're not doing at the moment is training agronomists. Many of the schools of agriculture don't train these people anymore. Plant breeders are relatively scarce, you know, and so we've changed the way in our education system's gone. We've changed the emphasis we put, and we're losing an enormous amount of expertise and information because people who know the farming community is shrinking, and the people who actually do the farming is shrinking, and the kinds of information they have is being reduced. You know, my uncle had a mixed farm. He knew everything about everything. You know, I was really lucky to spend a lot of time there, so I learned a whole lot of stuff that I would never have learned otherwise. Nowadays, we don't have that. So even if you get somebody who is in the inner city, goes to college, gets an agriculture degree, and goes out, they're missing 20 years of experience of growing up with this stuff. And unless they're really lucky and are now working with somebody who has that, it's very difficult to get. And so we're winding up moving into a mechanized version of farming that takes as much of the risk out of it, but also reduces our ability to manage a complex system.
Your picture there, I see hills, and it would seem to me that the microenvironment on one side of a hill or the top of a hill is different from what is in the valley between these little hills. But they all get the same plant?
Well, they get close enough to the same. So that's why I said what we've done is to breed something that will work really well in a range of different environments. So some parts might yield a bit better than others, all right? But on the whole, all of it works pretty well, all right? But if you took something and you try to get a plant that had a very large yield in the valley, all right, you may be able to do that. But that same inbred line gave you nothing on the top of the hill. And therefore, you don't want to plant this large area with that one because you get much less final yield. So you're not looking at the best in one particular environment. You're looking at what's the best yield I can get in this whole area that I'm growing, because I'm growing millions of acres.
Why does hybridization work so positively?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be swanning around in Bermuda rather than here. No. There's a lot of work going on about what is the basis of hybrid vigor, and we don't really know yet. We're getting closer, but I just have to say, there is some ideas as to why it works, but we don't have any genes. We don't know why, because it doesn't always work. So so the parents that you saw are good combiners. You can take two inbred maize lines and cross them, and the F1 looked just as bad. So there's a thing called combining ability that we don't understand, and we don't know what the genes are or what the combinations. And the problem really is that from nearly all of these things, it's probably going to be a combination of things, all right? And so if you have 10 different genes, each of which has 4 different versions, all right? Now you have a huge number of combinations you want to try and find, and that's hard.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Dr. Chris Cullis. Dr. Cullis is one of the world's leading experts on flax and how the environment changes its genetics. In the second part of our talk, we learned how humans over time transformed wild corn to the plant we eat today. In our final segment, Dr. Cullis will discuss the improvements that have been made in food crops and the trade-offs those entailed. Now, back to our talk.
This is the next piece, which was really to drive home this whole idea of hybrid vigor. So the top line in the black symbols is corn, and the bottom line is wheat. All right? You can see it starts going up at about the same time. We started breeding wheat in the same way, trying to improve it, but we haven't got a hybrid version, and so wheat and soybean and rice are growing at about 1 to 2% improvement in yield per year, and corn is going at about 10%. And that's why, again, this whole movement of growing corn, because you take this, corn and wheat probably don't compete very much, but corn and soybean can compete in the same kind of areas. Well, if you can get a much higher yield and a better price, you're going to grow corn and not soybean. Or any of the other crops, than potatoes or anything else. So suddenly corn can take over. When you have a bad drought, then that doesn't work either, but nothing grows really well at that point. So that's the challenge we have at this stage, is to find a way to improve these other crops, to try and make them look a bit more like corn, or at least be able to take advantage of the improvements that we've made in corn to attach those to other species. Rice is a little bit different, all right? So rice was domesticated, and it actually was domesticated in 2 steps, in 2 different kinds of steps. So corn, I showed you, you went through, you reduced the branching, you made bigger cobs, you then used F1 hybrids, and everything's worked really well. Rice appears to be domesticated twice. There's been 2 different systems, all right? And you have 2 different kinds of rice. You have japonica rice and you have indica rice, and they're actually very different from each other. Right? And they were domesticated separately. So for the first one, japonica is the older one of the 2, and it got domesticated, and you had a rice plant that was now being planted as such rather than being harvested from the wild. So you have to realize that when I'm talking about domestication, it's really the selection of seeds that you're going to plant out that are going to be an improvement, rather than just collecting what's growing out there in the wild. Right? It wasn't as if 10,000 years ago people suddenly started using these plants. They were using them prior to that, but they were really just collecting them from natural stands rather than actively managing the crop. Subsequently, there was a second domestication, and from that there was a selection and then a cross between the indica and the japonica, all right? And these 2, so it was really putting some japonica information into indica and then a separate selection subsequently, all right? And those 2 selections have gone along in parallel. And what's really interesting, and I'm going to show you in a moment, is that they've turned out to be incredibly different, all right? They've been selected, and essentially we have removed any trace of one from the other. So now I'm going to go and get some complicated molecular biology. So SNPs are where you have a single nucleotide. So rice has about 600 million nucleotides in the genome. That's how many specific ones they have there, right? And an SNP is one of those, which is different between 2 varieties. Right? And we've gone through now because we can identify all 600 million. And we can take 600 million from this one and 600 million from this one and align them up together and say, these are all the same, this is different. These are all the same, this is different. These are all the same, this is different. All right? So you can go through and look at tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these. All right? So the reason the previous slide was noted as a blue and a red is because that's what we're looking here. So when you look at the 2 origins, oops, I'm going to go back one more. So the japonica, the top line came from Oryza 3A, and the indica came from Oryza 1. And so if you look at the ancient versions, what you find is that Oryza 3 had about nearly 40% of its DNA was the same as the Oryza 1, right? And that was probably why it could cross as they were trying to get the indica rice. Right? But as we've selected it, the modern day japonica now has about 1% of the variants that are present in indica in them, and 99% of it is different from indica. And the inverse is true. So what you've gone from 40% here to 1% here, we've removed in selecting these every one that looked like an indica one, all right? And vice versa, there was only 11% in Ariza, but it looks like there was also an introgression, a cross between them. That's gone down to 2% of the Japonica is now present in indica. So as we've done the selection, what we've done is removed everything that was similar to this one and made a new line here, and everything that was similar to this one we've removed to make a new line here, and they are very, very different. And so this is a case of getting two different types of rice which have different properties, which are treasured for their differences, but the differences are based in the whole way in which that plant grows, and its genes are determined and everything else. It's not, so we couldn't say, oh, we could convert indica to japonica or vice versa easily, because there's so many differences, and these differences are all play off one another and have to act in concert. And that's the really hard part of the whole issue as you go through domestication. You wind up with something that you like, but what have you lost? All right? So for the previous one, what I've shown you've lost is everything from one you've removed, right? So one of the losses is this whole idea of diversity. That is, now we're trying to breed new varieties. Climate change is coming, we're looking at differences, we're getting changes in rainfall patterns, so you want to have something that's more resilient in some way. Do we still have that in this pool of individuals that we're using to develop new varieties? If we don't, we can spend as much money and we can grow as many plants and we can select as many as we like. We're not going to get there because we don't have the appropriate material to work with. And so that's been true for a number of our crops. As you've bred them, you've narrowed the base because you said, well, this is the best, this is the best, this is the best. I've got this one here. It's got no variation, and anything that I bring in is going to make it much worse. And I'm going to have to spend another lot of years in getting it back to where it was with this other little bit of variation. And if I'm going to look for the same thing, I'm simply going to get back to where I started. All right? So it's a big question about how do we get that. The second part is, what do we have to do? So for the major soybean breeding programs, they're growing between 1 and 2 million plants every year. Those are not plants that are used for producing seed to sell. Those are plants that are in a breeding program, and out of those, every year, if the breeders are lucky, they'll get one new variety. All right? And that variety takes about 6 years from the time they actually start testing it. All right? So there's about a 10-year intercrossing, selecting out the best, picking them out, pulling them out, and then you've got a whole set, and now you're going to grow a whole load more in 10 different environments with big enough plots to know how stable the yield is, and you've got about 4 or 5 years of yield trials there, and then you've got 2 years, this one's really good. Now I need 50 million seeds to give to the farmers, all right? I've got this really good plant, it's going to give me 50 seeds. Okay, I better plant a whole lot of it and collect the seed in another year, now I've got enough seed to be able to distribute. So it's a long, involved process, and that's inexpensive. And therefore, this is when I only have 15, maybe 15 or 20 parents in this pool that I'm trying to select from. Right? If I want to make that more diverse, I've now got to double, triple that whole operation. Right? Probably can't do it. So I'm going to have, so I take the best of the best and put them together and hope I get something better. There's a school of thought that says maybe you should throw some really miserable ones in there because they may have some genes that are really good, all right, that you can't find that are not in your current pool. And so you've got to decide how much do I have on the side of all the stuff that I don't think is going to work very well, but if I'm lucky, there'll be something really good in there. Right? So you've got to do all of those at the same time and decide how much effort you can put in that diversity versus the actual direct lineage of a new improved variety. And so it's difficult to put in those outliers unless they have a really specific advantage. So nearly all the outliers have an advantage, and that advantage is usually a disease resistance. So you get a new disease that hits, and there's the wheat rust that's supposed to be coming in from India. There's the banana. There's a couple of banana fungal diseases that are really potentially devastating if they catch hold. And so if you have a line that is resistant to that, doesn't succumb to that, then you're going to put that in your breeding program and specifically select for that very specific characteristic while improving the yield everywhere else. So what you do is you grow this one, you cross it, and then you back cross it. You keep crossing it to the best one, but always selecting for the presence of that resistance gene so that you can be sure that when you start to grow it out, it's not going to get killed. All right? How much variability do we have? So this was on the first slide. So on the top left, what you've got is the wild tomato on the very left and big boy on the right. Right? They're tomatoes that we've selected. They've got all this stuff. And here you've got all of the difference of color, size, fruit shape, the amount of seeds and everything else. And this is just so this is a tomato breeding program, and so what you want to do is to get something that works like this. Right? Why do we want tomatoes? So most of the time, things, if you grow them in your garden, they taste good. If you buy them from the supermarket, unless you're lucky, they don't taste so good, because you have to be able to pick them in California or Peru or somewhere else, put them in a box, ship them so they don't bruise, they don't squash, and then ripen them at the right time. They don't taste so good often. So for those tomatoes, if you look at heirloom varieties which taste good, and modern cultivar varieties, the amount of variation in those two groups is about the same. But like the rice, there's very little crossover between them. So we selected this group, and we selected this group, and we selected them in isolation. This comes back to a question that we had a little bit earlier, sort of, which is, this is the amount of the food production of the major crops for these different parts of the world that's based on crops that are endemic there. So Australia essentially gets virtually all of its food from crops that didn't exist in Australia before we brought them there, all right? Until we come down to places like West Central Asia, South Asia, and parts of Africa. Well, Africa's not doing so well because Africa's importing things, is growing things like soybean and wheat, all right, rather than corn. And so you can see we have this whole range of crops that aren't necessarily adapted to where we're growing them. So we're trying to force things. And that's what I'm going to talk about next week, which is, here's an indigenous plant that produces really good beans. It's better than soybean. It grows in this kind of soil in the Kalahari sands in southern Africa. The sand bushmen have used it as a food plant for a long time. And so what we're trying to do is to say, can we improve it enough to make it a viable commodity for resource poor farmers, and then eventually can we improve it enough to make it a functional food that can be grown in arid regions elsewhere in the world. Thank you.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.